Hi, I'm Pastor Vince with Clergy in Support of the Second Amendment, and today I want to talk to you about failure chains, mass shootings, and specifically the tragedy in Uvalde. In aircraft safety, auto safety, fire safety, school bus safety, firearm safety, building, and nearly any other case where safety is involved, the concept of the failure chain is used at some point. A failure chain is a sequence of events, all of which must happen for the horrible negative outcome you're trying to prevent to occur. Prevent any of them from happening, and either the event is greatly lessened or it doesn't happen at all. In our case, as we look at the failure chain, if we can prevent any of these events, we don't see the horrible tragedy and loss of life of 19 precious children and 2 precious teachers occur. Now I want to caution that this is being recorded on the 31st, late, and that most of the information that I've got here is from the 27th, with some updates for today, the 31st. This could all change, but these are the facts as I know them now. And I want to point out that none of this is about blame. There's been too much blame. Blame doesn't fix anything. We need to look at what happened. We need to figure out how to stop it. So let's do that. Let's look at the failure chains that led to this. The first link in the failure chain is a failure of the parents. Now, I'm saying a failure for them to recognize the threat. This is not meant as a slam at the parents and the grandparents who were doing the best they could, I'm sure. But it is a recognition of the reality that had they realized how bad the situation was, they might very well have been able to do something to prevent it. In fact, the grandfather said, and I saw him interviewed, he said, if I'd known that he had these weapons, I would have taken them from him. Now, that tells me a lot. This is Texas. Guns are common. 18-year-olds with guns is common. But this grandfather was alarmed that his grandson had an AR-15. Do you know how many 18-year-olds in Texas have AR-15s and don't do school shootings? And their parents are comfortable with it because they trust them? He didn't trust them. And sadly, I don't think he realized that he was that dangerous until it happened. So I'm saying we need to do all we can do to help parents to recognize when they need to get their kids help. And we need to make sure the help is there for them. I would ask us to remember back to Newtown, to another horrible day. Horrible. And I'd ask us to remember this. What came out in the wake of that was that murderer's mother, who became his first victim, had been trying to get her son help for months, had been trying to get him admitted to a mental hospital for months, and was unable to do so. That has to change. We have to be able to get these kids help when they need it. Because it's not just them that we need to be concerned about. The second failure is the failure of the school to recognize the threat. This young man was in school for a long time. Now, my understanding is he dropped out by the time of the shooting, but he was in school for a long time. Did anyone ever recognize how troubled he was? Did anyone try to get him some help? I don't know. But if they failed to do so, and I think they probably did, or the help wasn't adequate, then here we have another link, another opportunity to stop this that was missed. Link 3 is his friends, his peers, the people he's really going to talk to. The failure of his peers to recognize the threat. You know, in nearly every one of these cases, these people actually tell others what they're going to do. It comes out almost all the time afterwards that they told somebody, that there were warning signs all over the place, and the people that saw them the most weren't the parents, weren't the school, it was their friends. In many cases, school shootings have been prevented when someone has said something, including this week in Texas. It appears that many peers were aware he was planning something, including many of his online friends. His name in the online gaming first-person shooter community was school shooter. What more do you need? I mean, I get that it's fun to play some of these first-person shooter games, but school shooter? Many people could have said something, and had they done so, this might not have happened. Link 4 is the failure of law enforcement to recognize the threat, and this happens all too often. Now, in this case, sadly, it appears that the FBI was notified by one of the people he played online games with, but it may have been too late for it to get figured out and figure out where he was and so forth. The person who reported him was actually in the United Kingdom. So she reported him, and I give her kudos for that. But I want to talk about something. A long time ago, I was a paramedic. In fact, I was in EMS for about 10 years before I got hurt and had to leave. One of the things we did, and many people don't realize we do this, is that we transported anyone placed on a mental health hold. That's the way it was everywhere I worked in California. I suspect it's that way in most jurisdictions for the simple reason that once it's been determined that somebody is mentally ill but needs to be evaluated for mental illness, they're not under arrest, they're a patient. So they have to be handled by medical personnel. And who are the field medical personnel? I was. You know, I saw and transported tens of thousands of people in 10 years on mental health holds. I got very familiar with what the qualifications were to place somebody on one, how it worked in practice, how often it was done and why. And one of the things that I've noticed about these mass shootings is that in an inordinate number of them, the person, the mass murderer, has come to the attention of law enforcement for bizarre behavior, and nothing was done. The Navy Yard shooter came to the attention of law enforcement the night before he committed his mass murder, and the officers decided he was okay and left him in his motel room. I have to wonder, had they sent him in for a mental health evaluation, would the Navy Yard shooting have happened? I tend to think not. Then, there's the Giffords mass murderer. I won't say his name. That's one thing that Gabby Giffords and I and her husband can agree on. I won't say his name. But that man came to the attention of law enforcement for bizarre behavior over 20 times in a 2-year period. Worse, a lot of those were at his college he was attending, and fed up with the inaction of their own police department, the school officials at that college expelled him and said, you can't come back till you get mental health clearance, hoping he would get help. Again, after their own campus police department, I believe they saw him 6 times for bizarre behavior and didn't put him on a hold, send him off to be evaluated. Had he been sent in and properly evaluated, that's one horrible event that would probably have never happened. So law enforcement, it's not a matter of just their actions after it starts. Law enforcement has a critical role to play before. And let me say this, I recognize that we're only going to see and hear about their failures. It's really hard to figure out the mass shooting you prevented, because they don't happen. Okay, next link. Link 5. We failed to prevent this mass murderer from getting a weapon. Okay, here's where a lot of my fellow Second Amendment supporters, and I obviously am a Second Amendment supporter, a lot of my fellow Second Amendment supporters are going to have a problem here. But I think it's obvious if we could have prevented him from getting a firearm, a lot of lives would have been saved. He still could have used an edged weapon. A lot of people have been killed with edged weapons. He could have used a bomb. Those are somewhat harder to make than to get your hands on a firearm most of the time. But if we could have prevented him, if there was some way consistent with the United States Constitution that we could prevent people like him from getting firearms, no one's going to oppose that. Nobody. Not the least of which me. He still might have been able to get a weapon. We'll talk more about that later. Of course, you know, it's far from certain that we could do this. And that's what I'd like to talk about. First, I want us to think about this fact. Gun laws do not exist in isolation. They are dependent completely on the enforcement of other laws. If those other laws are not enforced, background checks are useless. When a background check is run, and I have had so many of them, you wouldn't believe it. But when a background check is run, the system looks for things such as felony convictions, domestic violence convictions, and mental health commitments by a court. Any of those things, you've had your due process, and under U.S. federal law, you are not allowed to have guns for the rest of your life. We can talk about whether that's right or wrong, but that's the law. And you'll flunk a background check. At least you should flunk a background check. But if crimes go unprosecuted, if people who are profoundly disturbed, as we've talked about, are never sent in for mental health evaluation, they won't ever be committed, they'll never be prohibited, and they will continue to pass background checks. This last Sunday, the New York Times, in one of their inner sections, had an entire page covered with people who passed background checks and then committed mass shootings. Don't tell me background checks are the answer. It's not. Plus, sadly, the background check system is imperfect and incomplete. Remember Sutherland Springs? The mass murderer in that instance walked into gun stores and bought guns, passed background checks. Why? Because the United States Air Force failed to report his felony and domestic violence convictions. He was doubly banned. But they never reported them to the FBI, as is required by federal law. So you see, gun laws don't exist in isolation. If other laws aren't enforced, background checks and other things are not going to work. Now, as far as being difficult to work, this can be said about most commonly proposed gun law changes. For instance, the banning of assault weapons. In a practical matter, most mass shootings are not committed with assault weapons. They're committed with handguns. It's easier to sneak them into where you want to kill people. And a sad, sad fact is that when it comes to a 10-year-old body, it really doesn't make a whole lot of difference whether you're shot with a 5.56 out of an AR-15 or a 9mm hollow point out of a handgun. If you're hit somewhere vital, you probably don't have much of a chance. So banning assault weapons is not going to work. And oh, by the way, the Supreme Court's already ruled out banning handguns, so that won't work either. Then there are the constitutional issues, as I mentioned just a moment ago. The Supreme Court is likely to allow background checks expanded to private sales to some degree. I don't think, in my studies of where they stand, that they're going to have a problem with expanding background checks to private sales between strangers. They might have a problem with expanding it to people who are well known to each other. Manchin's ideas, his current ideas, probably wouldn't have a problem with the Supreme Court. Whether you like them or not, I think that's where the Supreme Court would come down. That's about it. The Supreme Court's about to hand down a decision on concealed carry, and it is almost certain that they will also increase or correct the lower courts on the standard of review for Second Amendment cases. Lower courts have been upholding gun laws based on the wrong test, on a test that the Supreme Court specifically said in 2 decisions that they may not use. They've done it anyway. They're going to get corrected. And when they do, the assault weapons bans are not going to stand, and neither will magazine limits. Then there's, well, we can raise the age to buy a firearm to 21. That is definitely a no-go. 2 federal courts have already ruled it unconstitutional. There's one way you could do it and only one way. If you raise the age of adulthood back up to 21, then you could raise the age for firearms purchases. But at 18, you get your civil rights, and no, drinking alcohol is not a civil right. Then we can talk about the massive black market in firearms. Most of us who are law-abiding citizens never have contact with the black market in firearms. That's where most criminals get their guns. The U.S. Department of Justice released a study in January 2019 where they talked about this. And they found that not only did the majority of criminals' firearms come from black market sources, such as illegal gun dealers selling out of the back of their car to people they know cannot legally have a gun, and straw purchases. Straw purchases where you can't pass a background check, so you go get somebody to pass that background check for you, and you walk out of the gun store, they hand you the gun. That is a felony for both parties. However, it's almost never punished with jail time. So it keeps on happening. Those 2 things, black market dealers and straw purchases, comprised 87% of the sources of the 240,000 criminals' firearms who they interviewed. 87%. We already have a vigorous black market in firearms. What do you think is going to happen if, in spite of the Constitution, somehow you ban them? That market is going to explode. The same people that are dealing drugs and guns right now will do it on a much vaster scale. Do you think we're going to keep teenagers from getting guns? Well, can we keep them from getting illegal drugs? In my experience, the answer to that question is no, we can't. So you're not gonna keep kids from getting guns. In fact, in some other countries, I think of Mexico and Jamaica right off the top of my head, it's actually gotten worse when gun bans have been passed. Now, some have suggested red flag laws, and lately there's been talk of yellow flag laws, which apparently they have one of those in Maine, which is kind of red flag law light. This is where somebody shows up at a courthouse, fills out a form, and says, "You're a danger." And then, without you ever being notified, without you ever having an opportunity to defend yourself, the police show up at your door and take all your guns away. And then in a couple of weeks, you get a second hearing where you actually get to be present, and then you can defend yourself, and you may or may not get your guns back at that point, depending on what the judge thinks. Now, let me tell you some interesting things about that. They passed that law in California, and the first year was 2016. I looked at the statistics for 2016. Now remember that the judge looks at the paper, grants it. What's he going to do? He's only got one side of the story, and he doesn't want to be the guy who didn't give one. So he grants it almost all the time. But he knows in a couple of weeks that you're going to get if you're the subject, you're going to get your chance to present your side. How many times do you think the judge reversed his order? What percentage of the time do you think the judges reverse their orders upon hearing the other side of the story? 89% of the time. Almost 9 out of 10 the judge found were abuse. Don't tell me that in 2 weeks the danger went away. That doesn't happen. If somebody's dangerous, they're going to be dangerous in 2 weeks. No. The judge looked at it and said, this was abuse. So one of the giant problems with this law is the lack of due process. We'll talk about that in a moment. But another one is the amount of abuse that's allowed and the lack of punishment for said abuse. Due process, guaranteed by the 5th and the 14th Amendments of the Constitution of the United States. This law is skirting the edge of due process if it isn't crossing the line. And that's why a lot of people have problems with it. But as a practical matter, if there really is evidence that somebody's dangerous, why aren't they either in a mental hospital or in jail? Why do we think it's adequate to take their guns away, make them really mad, and then leave them on the street where they can go get a gun illegally, go get gasoline, go get a knife, a club, whatever, and go after whoever they wanted to go after? I want to deal with the person. And if they're really dangerous, I want them off the street. It really is that simple. The bottom line is breaking the link of keeping them from obtaining a firearm is a whole lot more complicated than just passing a law. So that said, let's move on to the next link. The next link is the failure of the school to prevent the murderer from entering the classroom. This can be broken down into, I would say, 2 parts. How he was able to get onto the campus and how he was able to get into the classroom itself. It appears that in Uvalde, the attacker was able to simply jump over a low fence and enter the school. That's not very secure. Consider how much more difficult it would have been for him if that school had been surrounded by a climb-resistant fence and there was only one way in and one way out. At least when the children are not entering or leaving. One way in, one way out. Where you have to be buzzed in, secure door. Would he have been able to simply jump in that fence and enter the school? No, he would have had to have gotten through that door. He probably wouldn't have been able to. Now let's consider one more measure. Let's put a well-trained and armed security officer or school staff member failing a full-time security officer near that single point of entry. Ideally, I'd like to see that be a retired police officer or retired military. A whole lot of those people would take a lower paying job to keep the kids safe. Now, if he gets through that door, he's faced with trained and armed opposition, who has the advantage. We'll talk about that in a moment. Trust me, these sick people, these kids a lot of times, are not Navy SEALs. They may think they are, but they aren't. And they are going to lose that gunfight every time. And the threat will be ended. Before rejecting this out of hand, as gun control advocates would demand that you do, consider the following. Even though there are literally now thousands of schools with armed security, where you have armed teachers and armed security staff. I'm not talking about one school resource officer for 4,000 students, where he's not going to be where he needs to be. I'm talking about where you have enough security, where you have armed teachers and armed staff, where you have that one entrance. How many times has there been attacked? The number is 0. Now here's another one that you probably don't know. I've looked at every school shooting since Columbine, and at every mass shooting since then, school and otherwise, over 90% of the time, the moment that shooter, that mass murderer, is confronted with another armed person, that mass murderer does one of two things. They either commit suicide or they surrender. Now, I've got my own opinion as to why that is, and I think it makes sense. These people have thought about this for a long time. They've fantasized about it. They know exactly how they want it to end. The moment another armed person shows up and starts shooting at them, or even they just see them show up, now they have lost control. They are not going to be able to control how this whole thing turns out. Maybe they want to die, they might get shot and be wounded and live. Maybe they want to live, they might get shot and killed. So in either of those cases, you implement your end plan. You drop your gun if you want to live, you kill yourself if you want to die. And that is what happens well over 90% of the time, the moment they are confronted with armed opposition. Less than 10% of the time do they decide they want to shoot it out. Just the presence of another firearm in somebody's hands ends it. Next, there's the matter of the attacker entering the classroom. Now, reports are in Uvalde, there have been reports over the last few days that the door was propped open in violation of policy. Today, that teacher's lawyer, and I thought that teacher probably had been killed, but I don't know. But that teacher's lawyer has gotten the Texas Department of Public Safety to retract that. So whether that happened or not, hopefully we'll learn later on. But if it did, it goes without saying, should have never happened. Had that door been closed and locked, there's a good chance the murder would have been kept out, or it would have at least been delayed. Especially since police weren't that far behind him, that would have been a good thing. Additionally, we have to ask, would doors in that school, classroom doors, have been unlocked if an announcement had been made over the PA system that there was a threat? I don't think not. I think the first thing the teachers would have done was lock their doors. But there was no announcement made. My understanding is that capability didn't exist. I don't know why. Again, that's my understanding at this point. Could change later. The seventh link is the inability of the teachers to defend their students. This is the one the gun control advocates really will not like. Had one of those teachers been trained, armed, and ready, would that murderer, that mass murderer, have been able to get in that door and kill the students? Well, some of you, like me, have had some training in clearing rooms. And I can tell you, as anybody who has had such training, that the defender of that room has the advantage. It's a huge advantage, especially if you're trying to enter a room against armed opposition and you're alone. You see, the person defending that room knows where you're going to come in. You're going to come in through the door. But the person coming in that door does not know where you are. They have to scan the whole room and find you. In the meantime, guess what you're doing? You're shooting at them. Probably from behind cover. Probably from a rest. And those are some ways to shoot very accurately. Doorways, hallways, and stairways are called fatal funnels by those in the know. For this very reason. Next time you see a SWAT team on TV or a documentary about soldiers clearing rooms, you will notice that almost all the time there are 4 of them. And they split that room up into quadrants so that they don't have to all scan the whole room. Trust me, I learned by trying it in a shoot house that if I tried it by myself, I was going to be dead. And the targets I was shooting at weren't shooting back. So the answer to the question, would he have been able to penetrate that classroom and kill those students had one of the teachers been trained and armed, is probably not. That teacher would have had their gun leveled at the door. And if they had any training at all, really, would have been putting rounds into him long before he could have gotten off a shot. For a reasonably well-trained person, making a headshot across the room is not a problem. So don't tell me, oh, he might have had body armor. First of all, he didn't. Second of all, headshots are the second thing you shoot at after center mass. Now, a lot of people say, well, teachers don't want to carry. There aren't any teachers that want to carry. You're not going to force them to do it, are you? Nope. That would never work. But teachers don't want to carry? How come anywhere in the country where training on firearms for teachers to defend their students is offered, and it is offered voluntarily, on their own time, on their own dime, how come when that's offered, every one of these training classes fills up, sometimes within an hour of it being posted online? The idea that there are no teachers who want to carry, so that'll never work, that is simply a lie. And those who are saying that know it. To those who would say guns are not the answer, I have a simple question. If your school is attacked, who are you going to call? You are going to call people with guns. So I'm sorry. When it comes to a school shooter, once they're in your school shooting people, guns are the answer. The only question is, how many people do you want to die waiting for another person with a gun to show up? That's link 7. Last link is link 8. And that's the failure of law enforcement to continue to assault that classroom until they ended the threat. Now, this is exactly what happens in most situations. You see, since Columbine, there's been one simple rule. When there's an active shooter, you assault that active shooter until they're dead or in custody. That is true if you're the only officer. It's true if there are 10 officers with you. It's true if all you have is your sidearm. It's true if you have an AR-15 and body armor. You keep doing it if officers have been killed doing it. You keep trying. If you know you're going to probably be shot, you do it anyway. Your life is secondary. The life of those victims is primary. Now, I've never been a cop. Worked with them every day in EMS. Know a lot of cops. Knew a lot of cops. Although I've never been a cop, I put my life at risk. I've done things that scared me to death, but I had to do them because it was my job. I put my life at risk. I've had people who would have shot me if I let them. And I've had people try and kill me with knives. One case I had to take one away from somebody. I had my bare hands. So please, don't tell me I don't know what I'm asking those cops to do. I do know what I'm asking them to do. But as far as I'm concerned, if I was in that situation, and I have been in situations like that, I would rather risk my life and die than live with myself if I didn't do what I was supposed to do. Now obviously none of this happened in Uvalde. Law enforcement apparently made an initial attempt to assault the room, and as soon as they took some hits, they backed off and they decided this was a barricaded suspect and all the children were dead. They assumed that. By the way, when I was my first day of EMT class, first introduction to emergency medicine, we all walked into the room and there is this picture drawn in chalk by the teacher of a guy standing up and he has this giant screw going through him. And we're all thinking, what in the world does this have to do with EMS? You know what he said? He said, I want you to learn this lesson. This is what happens when you assume. And then he broke it down for it. You make an ass out of you and me. Well, that's exactly what happened here. Except it wasn't just looking bad. Not only were children being shot while the police did nothing, while the kids were calling 911 and saying, where are the police? Why aren't they coming in? Why aren't they helping us? Not only that, not only did the 911 dispatchers hear children being shot, and I can't believe they didn't relay that to the on-scene commander. But as a paramedic, I know children were bleeding out. I learned about the golden hour. And I worked to make it work. To get my trauma patients to that trauma center in an hour. Before they bled out and died. Before they died of respiratory collapse. I don't know how many children died because the Uvalde Police Department and the other agencies that were there for that hour did nothing. But I know children did die. I just don't know how many. Those are the 8 chains of failure that we can see in Uvalde. We need to break some of them. You break just one of them and you save a lot of lives. Maybe you save all the lives. Maybe nobody dies. So why is the media talking about one and only one of these links? With the possible recent exception of recognizing what a bad job the Uvalde Police Department did. Why are they talking about the one that's going to be the hardest to change, even if we were able to get agreement that we were going to do it? And why are gun control advocates blocking efforts to harden our schools even when the plans don't involve firearms? Why are they against fencing our schools, single point of entry, things like this? Why is that? What would that be? How would that go against their beliefs as people that want to save children? It's taken me a long time to come to this conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, but I don't believe they want to save children. At least not until they have the gun laws they want. I wish it wasn't so, but I think they've come to the conclusion that a few dead children, under 40 a year, is worth the benefit of getting guns outlawed, or virtually outlawed. It's worth getting the Second Amendment repealed. So they don't want anything else done that might help. I wish this wasn't true. But I've watched them now. Good Lord. I'm in my 60s and I've watched them since I was a teenager. And they're still doing it. So I ask you, maybe I'm wrong about you. I'm not talking, when I talk about those people, about the average person who's a gun control supporter. I'm talking about the people behind the gun control groups. And yeah, I'm talking about you, Michael Bloomberg. I don't think you really want to stop these until you've got your gun control. Otherwise, why aren't you supporting these efforts? That's just my opinion. But I ask you, if you disagree with me on guns, fine. Can we please put the gun debate on hold long enough to secure our schools everywhere the way we secure them in the inner city? Oh! Plenty of problems in the inner city. School shootings aren't one of them. When was the last time you heard of one? All those guns out there. Teenagers with all those guns. Why not? Because you got to go through a metal detector to get into the school. That's why. Because there's armed security at the school in the inner city. Not there to prevent school shootings, but they do it. Can we please set the debate on guns aside? There'll be plenty of time for us to argue it out and fight it out after we do what we can to save children's lives. Let's do something that'll work. Well, that's about all I have to say. Except that, like everybody on both sides of this issue, my heart's broken. Absolutely broken over this. And I pray that this time we actually do something.